Your talk was so wonderful. I am reminiscent of a family event that I had. It was about 4 or 5 years ago. It was a 4th of July picnic in Rhode Island. And my grandnephew came home with 3 black students from Haiti. And he had been there on an HIV project. And it really astonished my family. They couldn't speak English. And it was his relationship with them that warmed our hearts and helped us to welcome them. He's now a physician in New York. And I think about he being a college student and being amongst folks from all over the world, as opposed to when I was in college. And our 3rd generation, our 2nd and 3rd generation, this is their normal life. Do you see hope in those students as far as breaking those borders of relationships, one heart to the other? That happened to me and my family.
Yeah, you pointed to the key issue. I mean, you know, what's the foundation of immigration reform? Getting to know the other and being in a relationship. When you have names and faces in the immigration issue, and that's really what it was for me, you see this very differently. And you know, how do we get into each other's fears deep enough so we understand that, but actually move beyond that to see kind of how this isn't necessarily a threat. This can make us really even better than we are. So really, that is the core. And I do see that issues like the DREAM Act, when we're working with college students now, that students who've gone to school with people who cannot go to college because of their legal documentation status, they simply have much more sensitivity to this issue. And because they've studied side by side with folks, and then they realize they come to the same place, but one has opportunities and one doesn't, even in the same country. So that's the core of it. The core of it is being in relationship. Yeah,
and it seems that those students, seeing other students that have come from countries that are deprived, it seems that that element of our Catholic community is driven to service projects more than attending church.
Yes, that's true.
Do you find that?
I think if you tap into the struggle and the desire for justice, that says something deep in a lot of students. And they recognize that that's important.
Questions, please. Question?
This question is not as much in terms of the religious, but I was looking at the map, and I've heard this many times. Why does there do you have any concept of why there are so many, economically it seems stronger in the northern hemisphere versus the southern hemisphere?
Why is it proportionality? That's just where the economic resources are. Yeah, I mean...
yeah, certainly we've seen economically in other countries, there's gold, there's land. Why does it seem to be in the northern hemisphere that there's so many more jobs? I was just wondering.
Well, oftentimes too, the people who have the technology to be able to extract those materials from the grounds are coming from developed countries as well. And so they often become sort of some of the leading beneficiaries of the resources of those places. But you do point to some major kind of questions about sort of the resource distribution and how they're allocated even when some of that development's going on.
But that's why I was just wondering why it happens to be this way.
Have you seen anything? Those are issues of development economics and issues certainly beyond my expertise, but what I do know is certainly the way this system sets up, it often kind of
privileges. Is this from what started years ago?
Yes,
and it's just continued?
In say Latin America, there's deep colonial kind of issues that, and even places like Mexico, the richest person in the world right now is Mexican. And Mexico has a lot of money. You know, part of the problem is Mexico.
So it's more political maybe than...
There are political and economic issues and cultural and historical issues that contribute to that imbalance. Yeah, but we do know is it's imbalanced. But how it got this way and
it just seems so
it's asymmetrical. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hear lots of murmuring. More questions?
I'm going to take another point of view. I'm going to take another point of view because I have a feeling I'm probably the only person with this point of view in this room. I live in North Carolina. I live in a community with about 14% unemployment, and that's by the government statistics. So that really means it's probably because we've had this for at least a decade. It really is closer to 30%. I belong to a parish where more than half of the people are Latino. We are not going to find a solution in this country if you don't include the people who are fighting at the lower economics, and you call them vigilantes, or you don't have them on a place where they're fighting for the lower end jobs. And when you just dismissed it in the middle of your talk like, well, those are they only take the jobs that people don't want. That is not the case where I live. I know people who cannot get jobs, and the only alternative they have is to go into the military. When you dismiss that element of this discussion, we are not going to find a solution in this country.
Which point did you say I dismissed?
When you had your map of the people, you had your vigilantes, you had your ICE, you had the corporations, you had the church, you had the political leaders. You didn't have the people who were fighting for the jobs and trying to put food into their families as well. And you also said, you mentioned North Carolina, and you kind of said, well, the migrants are only taking the jobs that nobody else wants. That is not the case.
Yeah, you point to an important issue, and that is that, that when the economy goes down, the first scapegoats, historically, have been migrants. We've seen this again and again happen in different places. What you point to is legitimate concern, and that is we're going to see more of this. And that people who don't have jobs and people who simply the migrants sort of coming over, how can we employ them if others certainly don't have work? It is true that they are doing work that most don't want. In your community, it sounds like there are some that would take any work that was there. And so what's also interesting is that I've seen in places like Austria and other places of Europe where the economies are doing relatively well. And there the case is still there's an anti-migrant mentality. And that's a question of identity. So I hear your unrest, and I see that this is a very legitimate concern. But how we distinguish between the rhetoric that targets migrants and what are the actual issues, I think is very important. I don't include them, I didn't include them with the vigilante groups. Very important to know that. This is a kind of initial sketch, and it doesn't include all groups. But this struggle for jobs is going to continue to be with us, and we will continue to get anti-immigrant rhetoric targeted at them in the midst of that unrest. But thank you.
Thank you, Father, for coming out here to talk about this issue. I'm a public school, high school teacher, so I've dealt with a lot of students, like you mentioned, the DREAM Act, whose lives just kind of end when they reach 18. They can't get a job, a driver's license, they can't go to college. But one thing I've kind of hoped, and maybe this is happening, is that some of the Catholic schools like Notre Dame would reach out more to those students and offer them scholarships. You know, being private institutions, they can go to those schools and get degrees, and even if they, you know, ultimately when they graduate can't legally get a job, you know, things down the road could change. Like this latest thing that President Obama did is going to help a lot. The two-year working papers, Social Security, they can, you know, will allow them to do a lot more things. So maybe you could address that.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is something that's been very near and dear to my heart, and that is trying to get schools like the one I work at to do more in terms of making a space for migrants to come, because this is what was done in previous generations, clearly was. What I have seen in terms of other colleges, Catholic universities, oftentimes the ones that are the least resourced are the ones that are doing the most. I know some schools that have as many as 20 or 30 students without documents that they're paying their way for. There are also schools in Texas that have a different legislative process than this. They have up to 2,000 to 3,000 in that place. You really point to the moral responsibility of Catholic institutions that need to open the doors. That was done in the past, that needs to be done in the future. So I share those concerns. Last thing on the Obama thing, I think it's on a 100-yard football field, I think it puts us on the 1-inch yard line. It's a movement forward, but it's still very small. And so hopefully it'll change maybe a little bit more the rhetoric around migration, but it doesn't really advance the ball far enough, in my opinion, but at least it's a start. So thank you.
I was wondering, do you consider it dangerous to the future of the world that only 1% of the people have so much and the rest of the world has so little? Could that be a very dangerous situation?
Yes.
And immigration is a slight attempt to cure that.
When I ask migrants, again, what would you say if I'm here? I can just see one at the Moroccan border, just at the breaking point, and he would just said, I just can't take it anymore. At the point of indignity, poverty, injustice, human rights violations, and that's how much more can the poor of the world sustain?
Well, you look at the future, at the history of France and the revolution, there reaches a point where they won't take, they will not take it anymore.
Right. And that's why, unless the issues of human insecurity are dealt with, we won't have true national security. Yeah.
I think it's a very dangerous thing.
It is. I think you're absolutely right.
Thank you for coming, Father. My question is, as to immigration reform, why, in your opinion, can't the federal government get it right?
Right now, we can't get it right because we don't have the political will to do so. The other thing is that any politician who takes on this issue sets himself as a target. And right now, it also connects it to issues that we're very much concerned about: the economy, terrorism, right now, American identity, pluralism. All these issues, I think, are very hard. So the nature of politics, we're losing a sense of the common good. Right now, the only content I hear in either party is just how to defeat the other person or what's wrong with the other person. I don't see the positive leadership that's needed to really create a better vision of the common good and really what politics are all about. So there's a lack of political will, there's a lack of imagination, there's often a lack of understanding, and there's often an inability to separate out the rhetoric on this issue from the reality of what's happening. And so until we're able to get enough courage to really fight through that, we're really, and even the modest progress that has been made, we know is so mixed with political motivations that the content of it just seems very little at best. But the end game is that this issue is with us. It's going to continue to be with us. And as a faith community, it's at the very core of who we are. So, thanks for coming tonight. Again, I invite you.